But nobody wants to write a translation that nobody's going to buy because it's so different from what they're used to. And the same thing happens with wine. And we have difficulties in the New Testament that we have in the Old Testament. We need to look at the context of when the word's used to decide whether he's talking about fermented drinks or not. Because the same difficulty happens in the New Testament that was in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we looked at the word, it was yayin. That's what most of the word references are. 144 of them is with yayin. But yayin means any grape product. It can be used from, talk about the juice that's inside the grapes while it's still in the cluster, all the way to alcoholic drinks. It's all yayin. Now they had sub-words that for more distinct parts, but yayin was the most common word that most people use. We don't have a word like that in English. We don't have a single word that means anything made from grapes. We just don't have one. The Greeks had the same thing. They had one called oinos. Oinos is exactly like yayin. It refers to all products of grape juice. The only way you can distinguish it is by looking at the context. You have to look at the context and say, is this alcoholic or not? Just because it's there doesn't necessarily mean it's alcoholic. And this is where a lot of people get caught up. There is a Greek word, and it's only used one time in the New Testament. There is a Greek word that's sikara. And sikara is actually the equivalent of the Hebrew word. This is the Greek word. And in Hebrew, we already looked at it when we talked about it, which is shikar. Notice that they do have a lot of words that kind of borrowed or similar in some shape or fashion. Both of those refer to strong drinks. They can be made from juice or it could be made from grain products. In other words, it could also refer to what we would call beers. But they would call that a strong drink. I know in our day and time, most people don't consider beers as being strong drinks, but they did. And it was called, in Hebrew, shikar. In Greek, it was sikara. That's only found in one spot, and that's in Luke chapter 1, verse 15. In fact, take a look at that verse. And now we're going to go into the New Testament and see the various words. Luke chapter 1, verse 15. When Zacharias is told what he needs to do with John, he said, "For he will be great in the sight of the Lord, and he will drink no wine or liquor." And liquor there is sikara. And he will be filled with the Holy Spirit while he is yet in his mother's womb. Okay, so he's basically been given the restrictions that are very similar to the Nazirite vow, but the Nazirite vow just said no products of grapes. And the angel here is making sure he understands nothing else either. No strong alcoholic drinks of any sort. By saying no wine, which is oinos, which is a general word, and no sikar, because sikar can be made from grain. So he's making sure no alcoholic beverages of any sort. There's another Greek word, and it's glucose. And that was equivalent to the Hebrew word tirash. that we looked at, that literally means sweet or new. Glucose in Greek means sweet or new, as in grape juice. It's only used one place again in the New Testament. That's in Acts chapter 2 and verse 13. And it's unfortunate, they still use the word wine here. It says, others were mocking, saying, they are full of sweet wine. And the word there is glucose. And what he's saying is, they're mocking him, saying, you're drunk on grape juice, is what they're saying. Why they put the word wine in there, it doesn't belong. But what they're teasing them is, you're all drunk on grape juice. They didn't believe him, they're acting funny, and they're mocking him. And making a taunt out of it. So then, we need to go back and then look at basically all the other words that when you see wine is oinos. And like we said, oinos by itself doesn't tell you whether it's alcoholic or not. It could be fresh squeezed grape juice, it could be stuff that's been stored a while, it's stuff that could be boiled down into syrup, it could be the alcoholic stuff. We just don't know without reading the context. So what we're going to do is look at and say, let's read these verses and start trying to decide, is the New Testament telling Christians that it's allowable to drink alcoholic drinks or not? Now, one that's used, and it's not actually has the word oinos in it, is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting with verse 20. It says, therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry and the other is drunk. What, do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. And they said, then the argument basically goes is that the Corinthians were abusing the Lord's Supper and turning it into a common meal, which wasn't being shared. And some were overeating and getting drunk, which is unacceptable behavior for a Christian in worship service. So Paul tells them to take their meals and their drinking home. Now read that passage over again. Does that make sense? Because what they're basically arguing is the implication of that Paul's basically telling Christians, if you want to overindulge, do it at home. Is that what he's saying? Is Paul permitting them to drink at home? Well, the key word here is the one that's used for drunk. The Greek word is methyl. Let me make sure I spell that right. Methyl. It literally means filled to the full. And that Greek word is very much commonly used the way we use the word drunk. Here's one where we don't have to search for another word. It works just the way we use the word drunk. Most of the time when somebody says drunk, what do we instantly think of? Somebody's been tipsy, had too much to drink. And that's the way the Greeks used it most of the time. Filled to the full. They had their limit on their alcohol. Okay? But we also use it as a past tense that when you had a drink and you're done, you drunk. We don't often use it that way, but we do use it that once in a while. And the Greeks did it the same way. Just to prove this, in the Septuagint version, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, turn over to Psalm 23. They use methyl in this psalm, in this translation. Psalm 23, verse 5 says, "Thou hast prepared a table before me in the presence of my enemy. Thou hast anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows." And what they used, where it says overflows, they used methuel. My cup has been filled to the full. You can't put any more because it's going to spill over. It's already spilling over. Okay? That word can be used not necessarily talking about being drunken. So another example, and we're going to talk about this a bit later in more detail, but in John chapter 2, and in verse 10 is another case where it's talking about the fact that people had enough to drink. Not necessarily alcoholic. In John chapter 2, and in verse 10, this is where the governor of the feast was talking to Jesus. And he said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when men have drunk freely, then that which is poor, you have kept the good wine until now." He's congratulating on him. And a lot of people say, "Hey, look, Jesus made wine and everybody, and brought it out, this alcoholic beverage, after everybody was drunk." Well, then he's promoting drunkenness, which is against what the Scriptures teach. But what the governor of the feast is actually saying, hey, most people put out the good stuff first, and when everybody had enough to drink, they bring out the lesser quality stuff because not as many people are going to be drinking anymore. But you brought out better stuff that's later on, after everybody's already satisfied. Fill to the full. And that's what he's saying. Everybody had their fill. And now you're bringing out the good stuff. And like I said, we'll talk about it again. So let's go back to 1 Corinthians 11. Let's figure out, is it talking about alcoholism? Is it talking about having an alcoholic drink? Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 21, it says, "For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first. One is hungry and another is drunk." Now notice that methuel in 1 Corinthians 21 is being contrasted with another word, hunger, which panei. What is the opposite of being hungry? Being full. Then what should be the correct translation? One is hungry and the other is methuel. One is hungry, the other has been filled to the full. That would have been that's the proper contrast. It's obviously being portrayed here. In fact, Leon C. Fields said, "Methui, in this case, is plainly contrasted with panei, which is correctly rendered as hungry. The antithesis, therefore, requires that the former be understood in the generic sense of surfeited, not in the narrow case or sense of drunken. The overfilled man is compared with the underfilled man. This is the interpretation adopted by